Okay, today's lecture is on the land. There's not a lot to say here, but just a brief introduction for the whole idea of the land. First thing I want to talk about is the inheritance of the land. The land always belonged to God, and God could give it to whomever he chose and establish conditions by which he could choose those to inherit it. God decided on what terms and when people would live in the land. So the land never belonged to Israel. It was like they were stewards of the land. It belonged to God, and he could do in the land whatever he desired. There were conditions on them for being able to stay in the land, and they had to fulfill those conditions. The reason that God gave it to Israel is because they were his treasured possession. He gave it to them so that they would make his glory known throughout the world. The land was theirs as an inheritance, but only as they were stewards of the land. It's a significant connection between Asia, Africa, and Europe, of course, and the trade routes went through there. And so whatever happened in the land would be known in the whole world. Thirdly, the patriarchs never owned the land. They possessed it in faith as a promise. Abraham bought a field with a cave in it to bury Sarah, but that is the only piece of land any of the patriarchs owned in the land, and they were buried there. Although the land was a gift from God, it was still Israel's responsibility to take possession of the land. The only way to do that was through battle. And the battles were directed and won by God. Von Rad emphasizes these holy wars for the purpose of God becoming known throughout the whole world. The only way to be victorious was by obedience, which showed their faith, because the Israelites were comparatively few in number, and the cities in the land were fortified cities, many of them, and so the only way for them to actually overcome and possess the land was if God was working with them and for them. During the period of the Judges, we find that Israel was disobedient, and although they didn't forfeit the land, God sent enemies to correct them and to discipline. The ministry of the Judges enables the people to experience God's chesed, his loving kindness. As they cry out to him, then he brings them out from under their enemies, and he doesn't, never in the period of the Judges does he say, you've turned away from me, so I've given up on you. He's continually waiting for them to call out to him, and when they do, he provides for them and answers their prayers and sends a deliverer. The land is characterized as flowing with milk and honey. That's not to compare it with Egypt, it's to compare it with the wilderness. In the wilderness, all they had to eat was manna and the quail, which God sent eventually, but in the land they would have crops and it would produce plenty, but it only produced plenty if it rained. When the Canaanites lived in the land produced plenty, even though they sinned. But when the Israelites lived in it, if they sinned, they suffered famine. This was to draw their attention to the fact that they were turning away from God. There's only one major river in Israel. It's the Jordan River, and it's not very long, and it's also not very wide. And so they were dependent for their crops on the rain, and so God had a kind of control button on them. He could switch off the rain. And that was supposed to be the signal to Israel that something was wrong and that they needed to turn back to God. If they were obedient, then the rains came and the land produced enough food for the entire nation. The Jezreel Valley was, and probably still is really, the breadbasket of Israel. It's a large, wide, flat valley that runs from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. But it only produces enough food when there's enough rain. When the rains failed, severe famine resulted. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, we read about how there was famine in the land, and David inquired of the Lord as to why there was a famine, and he was told that it was because of the way that Saul had treated the Gibeonites when Joshua had made an eternal covenant with them that should not be broken, and Saul had broken that covenant, and so God withheld the rain. The blessing that God promises is the rain that produces rich crops, and the plenty that was promised can only be experienced by obedience to the law of God, because when they're obedient, God sends the rain. A drought was a sign to the Israelites that they had, in some sense, turned away from God and that they needed to turn back. As we said before, the land was significant because the trade routes went through it. Travellers all had to go through Israel to avoid the desert in the east, and of course in the west is the Mediterranean Sea, and they didn't have terribly secure ships in those days, so to get from Europe to Africa, from Africa to Asia, and Asia to Europe and so on, you had to go through Israel. So it controls all the flow of humanity, and this bridge was supposed to be under God's control so that the nations would see who God is. His omnipotence is displayed in this place. Because Israel was a small nation and it was bounded by huge empires, both in the north and the south. There was the Syrians, of course, in the north, and then the Assyrians further north, and then the Hittites and the Babylonians, and then south of them was Israel. All of these were empires that were much greater in number and stronger in power than Israel. And so for Israel to remain in the land required God's miraculous protection and intervention. When Gentile nations tried to get control of the land, they were confronted with God. Secondly, the land is understood as a place of rest. Walter Kaiser says it's part of the promise. Walter Eichrodt says it's part of the covenant. It becomes a reality under Joshua. It isn't something added to the covenant, it's something fulfilled in the covenant. Initially in the Garden of Eden, all the elements required for civilization to grow were there, and it was possible for mankind to flourish with plenty. And it's a picture of what life with God is like if you walk in obedience. Adam and Eve had fellowship with God in the garden in the evening, and God's design for mankind was to live in obedience to God and have that kind of fellowship with God. When we come to Israel, they're supposed to experience the same kind of thing in the land. They lived in obedience, they experienced God's blessing and relationship with God. Adam and Eve's obedience would have kept them in the garden enjoying God's blessing. And so when the Israelites chose to obey, they too experienced what God intended, the blessing of his provision. The land is a place of rest, which is there all the time if people choose to obey. It's a place of rest from battle, and it's a place of rest from wanderings. It's also a place where the temple is going to be built, which is considered to be a house of rest. Okay. And then in Isaiah particularly, we find that the land speaks of the rest that's available in the future, but it's rest from sorrow and rest from trouble and rest from toil. The land itself was not the final rest. The final rest was the future centered in God. The significance for us is that we should believe and have faith and obey. Rest was not only a place, but it's a quality of life, which depended on their faith and obedience to the law. There is a spiritual aspect to the rest, which is directly related to their life centered in God. The covenant involves relationship with God, and the promise of land is a vital part, but inheritance of the land comes out of relationship. You only inherit something if you are related to the person who gives the inheritance. And so the Israelites had to maintain a covenant relationship with God in order to maintain their place in the land. We're told that there's going to be a place chosen by God where they would worship and sacrifice. And the ultimate site of the temple in Jerusalem is that place, and it's important simply because it's a place that God chose for whatever reason. But however, the land itself is also a place where the conflict occurs. It's not the ultimate rest. When they conquered Jericho, the spoil of Jericho was to be consecrated to God, and everything else was to be destroyed. So Jericho was supposed to display the consecration and respect the people were going to give to God. God wants first place. When people put God first, they're blessed. So that's why Achan brought a curse on all Israel through his disobedience, because the spoils of Jericho were devoted to God, but Achan took some of them, and he brought something that was devoted to God into the camp and brought destruction on the camp, in a sense, because those things were supposed to be destroyed. And so that is why they failed when they went up to fight because they were unaware of the sin that was in the camp and the devoted things that were there that were supposed to be destroyed at God's command. So the land is significant because it's a part of the promise, first of all, to the patriarchs, and then to Israel through the Mosaic covenant. And ultimately we'll see when we go on a little further that it's a part of the promises that God makes to David as well.